Welcome back to part 3 of our mini lecture on the Battle of the Somme. We've started the battle and this is now where we're up to. We've talked about the first day and really now we are looking at the continuation of the battle. Okay, and see what happens after that first day. Clearly, Haig's attempt to make a breakthrough on the first day has failed. And so the Battle of the Somme becomes yet another battle of attrition on the Western Front. We see numerous small offences being launched by the British and the French with various levels of success. If we take a look at these maps, the one on the left shows us the ground that had been made in the first week of the infantry attack, with the red being the British side and the blue being the French. We can see much more significant gains having been made by the French, and in fact their progress had to be halted and minimised while they waited for the French to catch up. So we can see that by the end of the first week only the French have actually made it into the German second lines. The British have not made that ground yet, and so they've had to dig into these areas. By the end of September, we can see that more ground has been made, and there was a particular push in the first half of September in order to take some key towns such as Pozières and then try to capitalise. And by the end of September, we can see that they have actually made progress into taking those German third lines. But the slow progress meant that there was never any significant breakthrough. The Germans were always able to, instead of being sent into chaos, the Germans were always able to push back and dig new reinforcements as the British and the French were pushing forward. If we take a look at this map, which has got the key on it for us, that's 8 kilometres in length. And we can see that from here to here, we're talking no more than 12 kilometres overall by the end of the Battle of the Somme. 12 kilometres, that's it. Until early September, the Allies had advanced only between 1.5 and 5 kilometres, really. On this map, we can see that this is the 14th of July, this is the 15th of September, and then there's the final push after the 15th of September out until the end of the Battle of the Somme at the 15th of November. You may recall that it's about August 1916 that Falkenhayn, the commander of the German army, is replaced by Ludendorff and Hindenburg. Until that point, Falkenhayn had ordered very strong German defence and counterattacks to never give any ground, and this had led to massively high casualties on the German side, as well as the casualties being inflicted on the British and the French. When Ludendorff and Hindenburg take control of the German war effort from late August 1916, they have a slightly different strategy. From that point forward, the Germans are allowed to surrender any non-vital defences and focus instead on holding strategic points. This gave the local commanders a lot more flexibility in their defence strategies and to make decisions about which particular points of the line were worth holding and which could be surrendered without significant German casualties. Despite this change in the defensive strategy, the British and the French were still unable to achieve any significant breakthrough. And again, we see slow pushing back, but no breakthrough is made at all during this time. One of the things we have to talk about with the Somme, and I want to look in class at sources to help us understand this, is the conditions that are faced particularly by the British and also the French infantry as they are moving forward. And the Somme is very much associated with mud. And in fact, one of the recent books out on the Battle of the Somme is called Somme Mud. And we can see here some of the conditions. These men are just caked in mud all over them. These British soldiers, they've got the carrying equipment. They're actually got stretchers on their backs going into battle. You could also see here the rudimentary trench in which they are. It's not clear from the labelling on this photograph whether this is initially the British frontline trench or a position held later on. But you can see the conditions in which these men are operating. This one here is a group of Canadian soldiers, and again you can see the mud all over their uniforms. Very heavy uniforms that they're wearing. Imagine wearing those into battle as you're trying to cross no man's land. This here is a little bit behind the lines, but again you start to see the level of the mud. This is actually a horse-drawn ambulance about to take these injured men to a hospital further behind the lines. And again, we've seen the horse still very much used for logistical purposes to move things around. You can see the level of, puddles of mud that they are having to move through in order to, move things around. There was a lot of rain in this area, and it was a very wet period of time. Thus, we've got the mud. So as we've got such huge numbers of casualties, particularly on the French side, and we are seeing decimation of Kitchener's recruited army, including groups called PALS battalions, pals, friends, who had all joined up together, perhaps from the same workplace or perhaps from the same town. In some cases, almost entire PALS battalions dying in battle on the same day. And also there was a movie made about the Battle of the Somme, shown on cinema screens back in Britain, intended to increase morale on the home front about what the British soldiers are achieving and enduring, but in fact had the negative impact because the home front was actually seeing firsthand the experiences of their soldiers. And so we need to look at the Battle of the Somme as a turning point in the British home front's understanding of what this war was doing, and the fact that the Battle of the Somme did not achieve a significant breakthrough, the fact that this war was going to drag on in these kinds of conditions for so long. There are, however, some new tactics introduced during this battle, including the creeping barrage. Now, this particular tactic involves, you can see here in this diagram, from the British trench, the infantry get out and move forward, and the creeping barrage is intended to be an artillery barrage of smoky shells, which provide cover for the troops as they move forwards. So obviously as the infantry moves forward, so does the artillery. It creeps forward just ahead of the infantry, and it provides a cover and an element of surprise for the infantry moving forward. This picture is intended to show you the same kind of creeping forward approach. The creeping barrage was used in the Somme, not as successfully as it could have been because it needs absolute precision from the artillery in order to be effective. And unfortunately for the British, we don't quite have that yet at the Battle of the Somme. The other significant introduction to the Battle of the Somme is the use of the tank. So tanks are used for the very first time in September 1916 in this Battle of the Somme. They're British tanks. You can see how big and heavy and unwieldy they are. Not really used very effectively in the Battle of the Somme. They proved not to be very reliable. There were only about 50 tanks that were made and ready for this battle. Only half of them actually made it to the front line ready to go because the other half broke down before they even got there. And then, of course, many got bogged down in no man's land because it had been raining yet again. And we've seen some of the pictures of what no man's land was looking like. This is not perfect territory for a tank. And this was a big lesson that was learned at the Battle of the Somme. If you want to use your tanks, you can't churn up no man's land before sending them in. The coordination between the tank and the infantry also needs to be effective. So you can see in this shot the way that the infantry is moving up behind the tank. But if the tank goes too slow, your infantry get a little bit impatient, move ahead of the tank, and this becomes a problem. So the coordination of the way in which the tanks are used is yet to be developed. But the Battle of the Somme is where we start to see experimentation with the use of the tank. Some of the tanks were destroyed by artillery fire, but we do see the tanks being used effectively, particularly to take the village of Flers, which is behind the German second lines there. Haig saw the potential. Also, the Germans, who had never seen these beasts in action before, the tanks had a moral impact, an impact on the morale of the Germans, who were terrified by these massive beasts bearing down on them. Haig ordered another 1,000 tanks to be built. While they hadn't really done their job as well as they'd like, at the Battle of the Somme, he saw their potential, and we will see more tank battles coming up as World War I progresses. The Battle of the Somme really ends around the 18th of November as snow begins to fall on the battlefields of the Somme. To get an understanding of what it's like, this is a picture of Australians in the Somme in December 1916, and this is the battlefields of the Somme early in 1917 under a cover of snow. We rarely see battles taking place during the deep winter months because of the conditions. At the end of this time, the Allies had gained 12 kilometres of ground at its maximum. What had they suffered? In terms of casualties, the British had suffered 600,000 casualties. The French, who had taken just as much ground as the British, 195,000 casualties. Something to reflect on again in terms of the tactics used and the level of experience of the infantry and the artillery moving in. An interesting point to see here on the line is that the French had made as much ground as the British in the first 2 weeks, and then it took the British the next months to catch up with the ground that the French had made in the first week. Germans had also suffered very badly from this battle, with 450,000 casualties defending these 12 kilometres of ground at the Somme. The Somme is very much known as a battle of attrition, and it is this point which we start to see a real change in the attitudes of many of the British soldiers, which we'll come back and take a look at. This is really the battle that starts to bring about that attitude of lions led by donkeys, the brave British soldiers going into battle, yet led with strategies and tactics of foolish generals who really had no idea what was going on. General Haig was blamed by many for the disastrous campaign by the British, but he did not accept responsibility for wasting of lives. And this is an important point that we'll look over and see the different historical views of Haig's commandership at the Battle of the Somme. Haig continues to have support from the King, although the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, didn't really like him. But the King does continue to support Haig, and we're going to see Haig remain as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army right through to the very end of the war. And we will see in 1918 that he does win a number of significant battles which lead to Allied victory at the end of the war. So this is it for the Battle of the Somme, and what we need to reflect on is the impact of this battle. Clearly huge casualties, very little territorial gain, but also reflect upon the psychological impact on all sides of what this battle had achieved.